Amina Thompson's footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floors of SpinTech's towering New York City headquarters. Dressed in a cleaner's uniform, simple blue shirt, black pants, and worn sneakers, she moved quietly through the lobby, pushing a cleaning cart stocked with supplies. To the employees bustling past her, she was invisible, just another face among the maintenance staff. But in reality, Amina was far from ordinary. She was the founder and rightful owner of SpinTech, a company she had built from the ground up with her innovative tech vision and leadership. However, over the past few years, Amina had noticed troubling signs. Reports of toxic behavior, poor management decisions, and an atmosphere of subtle racial and gender biases had reached her. Instead of stepping in with a sweeping authority that could have immediately altered the company's course, Amina chose a different path. She wanted to see the truth herself, to understand how deeply the rot had set in, and who was responsible. So she handed the CEO title to her brother Marcus and went undercover. As she made her way past the reception desk, she felt the curious eyes of a few employees. A young woman in a business suit glanced up from her phone, eyed Amina with a brief but dismissive look, and returned to her conversation. Amina swallowed the brief sting of indignation. It was exactly what she had expected. This was the reality faced by people who looked like her, black, female, and in this moment perceived as being in a low-status position. The experience only confirmed her suspicions. Amina entered the hallway that led to the upper floors, passing a plaque engraved with the company's mission: innovation, integrity, inclusion. She almost scoffed. Inclusion? She would soon find out how far SpinTech had strayed from those values. Her first encounter with Jeff Wilson, the chief operations officer, happened quicker than she anticipated. Jeff was a towering man, always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with an aura of arrogance that seemed to follow him like a shadow. As she swept the floor outside his office, Amina heard his voice before she saw him. "Hey, new girl," Jeff barked, making her pause mid-swipe. Amina glanced up, meeting his eyes for the first time. His gaze lingered a moment too long, taking in her uniform and her face, and she could see the immediate dismissal in his expression. She didn't exist to him beyond the cart she was pushing. He pointed to a spot on the floor that was already spotless. "You missed a spot," he said with a smirk. Amina's hand gripped the broom a little tighter, but she smiled politely. "I'll get right to it, sir," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Jeff didn't move. He stepped closer, looking her up and down in a way that made her feel small, even though she knew she held all the power. But she couldn't reveal that. Not yet. "You should be grateful for a job like this," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "People like you don't usually get to be in a place like SpinTech."
Amina felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She gave him a nod and returned to sweeping, even though every instinct told her to confront him. But this was only the beginning. She needed to see more.
The next few days were filled with more encounters like the one with Jeff Wilson. Each one chipped away at the professional facade Amina had carefully constructed, revealing the deep-seated racism and arrogance lurking in SpinTech's upper management. But Jeff was the worst. From the moment she arrived, he seemed to take particular interest in her, not because he recognized her potential or her intelligence, but because he saw her as something to dominate and belittle. On her second day, Amina was quietly mopping the floors near Jeff's office when she heard his booming voice from around the corner.
"Hey, you missed a spot again," he called out, without even glancing at her. His tone was casual, like he was pointing out something insignificant. Amina turned to see him standing there, watching her with a smug grin plastered across his face. He didn't need to give her orders, but it was clear he enjoyed asserting control.
Jeff sauntered closer, his hands in his pockets. "I don't know how it works where you come from, but here, we have standards." His voice was laced with condescension, each word delivered with a sharp, dismissive edge. Amina felt her jaw tighten. She had dealt with men like Jeff before. They were everywhere men who believed that their position and privilege gave them the right to demean others. She wanted to tell him exactly who she was, to wipe that smug smile off his face. But she held her tongue. She needed more time, more evidence of how pervasive this attitude was. Jeff leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, clearly enjoying the power imbalance he thought he had. "You're lucky to even have a job here," he said, his voice dripping with patronizing arrogance. "I mean, let's be real, people like you don't usually get opportunities like this." Amina's heart pounded in her chest, but outwardly she remained calm. "I'm just here to do my job," she replied evenly, her hand still moving the mop across the floor. "Good," Jeff said, turning on his heel. "Just don't screw it up." The words echoed in Amina's mind long after Jeff had disappeared down the hall. She was well aware of what people like you meant in his world. In Jeff's mind, Amina didn't belong in a place like SpinTech because she was black, because she was a woman, and because she didn't fit into his narrow view of who deserved success. As the weeks went on, Jeff's behavior grew increasingly hostile. What began as veiled insults quickly turned into overtly racist comments. Each day, Amina was subjected to a barrage of microaggressions and thinly veiled threats. He never missed an opportunity to remind her of where he thought she belonged. "You know, people like you don't make it very far," Jeff sneered one day as he passed by her in the hallway. "You should be grateful that SpinTech even lets you step foot in here."
Amina's blood boiled. Jeff's words weren't just insults, they were a reflection of the systemic racism that pervaded the company's culture. She had witnessed it not just from him, but from others in management as well. Karen Theobald, the head of marketing, often made dismissive remarks about the Black and Latino employees in the office, treating them like they were second-class citizens. Chris Carter, the head of finance, was known for his racist jokes in private meetings, always making sure he was surrounded by people who would laugh along with him.
But Jeff was the worst of them all. He took pleasure in demeaning Amina, as if her very presence was an affront to everything he believed SpinTech stood for. One day, after she had cleaned the conference room where the board held its meetings, Jeff cornered her as she was gathering her supplies. "You're too pretty to be a cleaner," he said, stepping into her personal space. His voice was low, predatory, as if he were offering her a compliment. "If you play your cards right, maybe I could get you a better job around here." Amina's skin crawled. She stepped back, her hand tightening on the handle of the mop. "I'm fine where I am," she said, her voice cold and controlled. Jeff's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he leaned in closer. "You think you're too good for my help," he hissed. "You're just a cleaner. People like you don't get real jobs unless someone like me gives them a chance. So maybe you should think about that the next time you mop my floors." It took every ounce of strength Amina had not to react. This man, this racist, arrogant man, had no idea who he was talking to. But soon he would. Soon he would learn that the woman he had been belittling and harassing was the one person who could end his career with a single word. And when that day came, Amina would make sure that Jeff and everyone like him would never again underestimate the power of someone like her. As Jeff turned to leave, Amina stood tall, her resolve stronger than ever. The day of reckoning was coming, and when it did, SpinTech would never be the same. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the office hallways, and Amina pushed her cleaning cart silently, blending into the background as she had for weeks. Every day she was confronted with the reality of what SpinTech had become under its current management, a company where racial bias simmered just below the surface, poisoning the atmosphere. Karen Theobald, the head of marketing, was particularly insufferable. Karen exuded a false charm in front of senior management and the board, but when it came to dealing with Black and Latino employees, she became a different person. Amina had witnessed Karen undermine them at every turn, her words laced with condescension. One afternoon, as Amina cleaned the glass walls outside the conference room, she overheard a meeting in progress. Karen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by junior staff members, many of whom were people of color. Marcus Sanchez, a talented Latino marketing strategist, presented an idea for a new ad campaign targeting younger audiences. His concepts were sharp, innovative, and precisely what SpinTech needed to revitalize its brand. But Karen, sitting back in her chair with her arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "Marcus, I'm not sure this approach aligns with our company's core demographic. Maybe it's a bit too ambitious." Her voice dripped with false politeness, but the message was clear. She wasn't interested. Marcus, visibly deflated, tried to explain his vision further, but Karen quickly dismissed him. "Let's circle back to this later. In the meantime, I'll draft up a few ideas myself that fit better with what we need." Amina watched the frustration in Marcus's eyes, but he nodded obediently, aware that pushing back could cost him his job. Karen had a way of making it clear that people like Marcus should feel lucky to even have a seat at the table. Later, when the campaign was finalized, Karen took full credit for it, never once acknowledging the groundwork laid by Marcus or the other junior team members of color who contributed. It wasn't just Marcus. Amina saw it happening every day. Black and Latino employees would pitch ideas, only to be questioned more harshly or dismissed outright. When their ideas were good, they were appropriated by higher-ups like Karen, who never acknowledged their efforts. The culture was one of subtle exploitation, where people of color were treated as though their contributions didn't matter. One day, while Amina was emptying the trash in the break room, she overheard Karen making a disparaging remark to a fellow executive. "I mean, do they really think they're going to climb the ladder here? They should be grateful they even made it through the front door." The toxic culture was suffocating, and Amina's anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. She had built SpinTech with the intention of fostering innovation, creativity, and opportunity for all. But under the leadership of people like Karen, it had become a place where people of color were treated as invisible or outright incompetent, no matter how skilled they were. Chris Carter was another thorn in SpinTech's side, but his offenses went beyond just racism. As the head of finance, Chris held significant power over the company's budget and investments. But instead of safeguarding SpinTech's resources, he was funneling company money into his own pockets. Amina had quietly observed Chris during several board meetings, noting his dismissive attitude toward any employees of color who dared to suggest cost-saving strategies or financial improvements. Chris had a habit of interrupting, especially if the ideas came from Black or Latino staff members. One particular meeting stood out to Amina. It was a strategy session for allocating resources for an upcoming project, and a young Black analyst named Erica Davis presented a thorough financial breakdown that would optimize the budget and save SpinTech a significant amount of money. Chris barely glanced at her presentation. "Erica, these numbers are interesting, but I'm not sure you fully understood the complexities of the budget," he said, his voice oozing condescension. "Maybe if you had more experience in handling large-scale projects, this would make more sense."
Amina saw the hurt in Erica's eyes, but like many others in the company, Erica bit her tongue, knowing that challenging Chris could result in retaliation. After all, Chris wielded his power like a weapon, and there were whispers that those who crossed him often found themselves without a job.
But it wasn't just his demeaning attitude that was the problem. Chris was also corrupt. Amina had her suspicions for a while, noticing discrepancies in the financial reports, but it wasn't until she did some deeper digging that she uncovered the truth. Chris had been siphoning off company funds, masking them as business expenses while financing his personal lifestyle. One evening, after everyone had left the office, Amina accessed the financial reports she had authorized as the company's true owner. She compared the official records with Chris's personal expense claims and found glaring inconsistencies: lavish dinners, first-class flights, and five-star hotels, all charged to the company under vague business pretexts. The more Amina uncovered, the angrier she became. Chris wasn't just undermining the work of black and minority employees, he was actively harming the company she had worked so hard to build. And the worst part was, he felt untouchable, knowing that his white male privilege had shielded him from scrutiny for years. Amina made a mental note to keep this information for the right moment. Chris Carter would be exposed for both his corruption and his racist behavior, and Amina intended to make sure that justice was served. As Amina spent more time observing SpinTech's inner workings, the racial divide in the company became increasingly clear. White employees were given more opportunities, received promotions faster, and were treated with greater respect and leniency by upper management. Meanwhile, black and minority employees were constantly scrutinized, doubted, and denied the same chances to succeed. The contrast was stark. Amina watched as Jeff Wilson, the COO, regularly praised white employees for their leadership potential and fast-tracked their promotions, even when their performance was mediocre. In contrast, people of color had to work twice as hard just to be seen. When they did perform well, their achievements were minimized or attributed to luck rather than skill. Amina noticed this pattern with a promising software engineer named David Jackson, one of the few black men in a technical leadership position at SpinTech. David had spearheaded a critical software update that had saved the company millions in potential downtime, but when it came time for recognition, Jeff casually mentioned David's work in passing and instead focused on a white engineer who had contributed minimally to the project. The division didn't stop there. Amina also saw how the company's diversity initiatives were merely performative. SpinTech's website boasted of its commitment to diversity. But in practice, the people of color who did manage to get hired were relegated to low-level positions with little chance of advancement. When minority employees raised concerns about racial bias or unequal treatment, they were either ignored or subtly punished. One afternoon, Amina overheard a conversation between Jeff and another executive as they left a meeting room. Jeff was laughing as he said, "You know, these diversity hires are great for PR, but I wouldn't trust them with anything important." The words hit Amina like a punch to the gut. It was this exact mentality that perpetuated the hostile work environment for people of color at SpinTech. White employees were seen as the default capable, competent, and deserving of trust. Meanwhile, black and minority employees were treated as tokens, their capabilities constantly questioned and their potential dismissed. Amina began noticing how promotions were often handed to white employees, even when black and Latino workers had demonstrated greater competence. When a black employee did manage to get promoted, it was usually after years of being overlooked, and even then, they were often kept out of senior leadership roles. The divide was systemic, and Amina knew it stemmed from the top. Jeff, Karen, and Chris perpetuated this culture, creating an environment where people of color were set up to fail or, at best, remain invisible. The racial hostility wasn't always overt, but it was persistent and undercurrent that permeated every interaction, every opportunity, every closed-door decision. Amina's heart ached for the employees who had been mistreated, belittled, and ignored. She knew what it felt like to be unseen, to have your worth questioned simply because of the color of your skin. But soon, she would change all that. She had seen enough. The day of reckoning was coming, and Amina was ready to expose the toxic underbelly of SpinTech once and for all. When the truth finally came out, there would be no more hiding behind the polished facade of corporate success. Amina would make sure that those who had perpetuated this environment of racism and corruption would face the consequences. SpinTech would become the company she had always envisioned, a place where innovation, respect, and diversity thrived, free from the shackles of prejudice. It had been weeks since Amina Thompson first set foot in SpinTech disguised as a cleaner. Each day she quietly observed the company she had built, but the toxic atmosphere created by men like Jeff Wilson had become unbearable. His condescending looks, casual dismissals, and thinly veiled racist remarks toward her while thinking she was just a low-level cleaner were growing worse. Amina was pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway when she felt the weight of Jeff's gaze before she even saw him. The hall was quiet, and she was hoping to finish quickly and avoid another encounter with him, but no such luck. She heard the sharp clack of his polished shoes approaching. As he came up behind her, his presence felt like a looming shadow. "Missed a spot again," Jeff said, his voice slick with arrogance. He was standing too close, his eyes roaming over her as if assessing her worth and finding her lacking. His smile was cold, devoid of any real warmth or respect. Amina didn't respond, keeping her focus on her work, but Jeff wasn't one to let things go easily. He leaned in, his breath far too close for comfort, and whispered, "You're too pretty to be doing a job like this. Scrubbing floors isn't for someone like you." Amina's hands tightened on the handle of the cleaning cart, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to reveal who she was. Not yet. Jeff's voice dropped to a more intimate tone as he continued, "You'd do a lot better if you learned how to play nice with people like me. Maybe I could help you out, find you something more fitting for your talents." The insinuation was clear, and it made Amina's skin crawl. She could hear the unspoken message beneath his words: comply with his demands or face the consequences. This wasn't just harassment, this was a power play, fueled by Jeff's belief that he was untouchable, especially when it came to someone he saw as an inferior black woman. Amina turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I'm fine where I am," she replied, her voice steady. Inside, however, her anger was simmering. This man, so convinced of his superiority, had no idea who he was talking to. Jeff's smile faltered for a moment, and something darker flickered in his eyes. His face twisted into a sneer as he leaned even closer, his voice a threatening whisper. "You think you can afford to say no to me?" He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed down the empty hallway. "I could have you fired with a single word. You wouldn't last a day without me keeping you around. People like you should be grateful to have a job here." His words hung in the air like poison, dripping with racism and entitlement. Amina forced herself to remain composed, but inside she knew that the time was coming for her to reveal her true power. She wouldn't tolerate this much longer. The day had been long, and Amina was more than ready to go home. She had seen enough of Jeff's arrogant behavior to last a lifetime, but she wasn't quite prepared for what would happen next. As she left the SpinTech building late that evening, the parking lot was mostly empty, lit only by a few scattered streetlights. She walked toward her car, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the office, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Jeff had been watching her all day, and now he had followed her outside. "Amina," his voice cut through the still night air. She stopped but didn't turn around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was an edge to his voice, something more threatening than usual. When she finally turned, Jeff was standing only a few feet away, his eyes narrowed and filled with malicious intent. "You've been avoiding me," he said, stepping closer. "I don't appreciate being ignored, especially by someone like you." Amina kept her distance, her expression unreadable. "I've been doing my job," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't have time for games." "Games?" Jeff's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. "This isn't a game, Amina. I could end your career with a single phone call. People like you don't get second chances, and you won't find another job this good anywhere else." He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "You think someone like you, a black woman, stands a chance in this world without help? Without me?" He spat the last words with venom, his racism now fully on display. "You're lucky to even be here." Amina felt a surge of anger rise within her. His words were no longer just about her position at SpinTech, they were about her very existence in this space, his belief that she didn't belong, that she was somehow lesser because of her race and gender. The audacity of it was staggering. Jeff continued, unaware that he was digging his own grave. "If you meet me in my office after hours tonight, we can come to an understanding. Otherwise, you're out by tomorrow morning. No one else is going to hire a girl like you." His smirk widened, confident in his ability to control her fate. But he didn't know the truth. He didn't know that Amina wasn't just a cleaner. She was the owner of the entire company, and she was done playing along. "Jeff," Amina said, her voice low but filled with resolve, "you have no idea who you're talking to, but you're about to find out." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jeff standing in the parking lot, his smirk faltering as uncertainty crept into his eyes. The next morning, SpinTech's boardroom was filled with tension. The senior management team was gathered for an important meeting, but no one knew why. Jeff Wilson sat at the head of the table, his usual arrogant smirk plastered on his face. He was still basking in the confidence of last night's encounter with Amina, certain that he had her cornered. He glanced at his watch, annoyed that the meeting hadn't started yet. "What's this about?" he muttered under his breath, but no one answered. Just then, the doors to the boardroom swung open, and Amina walked in, but she wasn't dressed in her cleaner's uniform anymore. She wore a crisp white blazer, black tailored pants, and sleek heels. Her hair was styled neatly, and her presence radiated authority. She walked with purpose, her head held high, and all eyes turned to her in surprise. For a moment, Jeff didn't recognize her. His brow furrowed in confusion as he glanced at her up and down. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a board meeting. You don't belong here." Amina didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the head of the table, where Paul Thompson, her brother and the acting CEO, stood waiting for her. Paul cleared his throat and addressed the room.
"Before we begin, there's something important I need to share with all of you," Paul said, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, it's someone I need to introduce." The board members exchanged puzzled glances as Paul gestured toward Amina.
"This is Amina Thompson," he said, smiling proudly. "The true owner and founder of SpinTech." The room went dead silent. Jeff's smirk vanished, his face draining of all color as the weight of Paul's words hit him like a sledgehammer. Amina's gaze locked onto Jeff's, and for the first time he understood the gravity of his mistake. "For the past few months I've been working undercover as a cleaner," Amina began, her voice steady and commanding. "I wanted to see firsthand how my company was being run, and what I found was deeply disturbing." Jeff stammered, his voice weak. "I didn't know. I had no idea." "Exactly," Amina interrupted. "You had no idea who I was. But that doesn't excuse how you treated me or anyone else here." The rest of the board members sat in stunned silence as Amina continued, recounting the racism, harassment, and corruption she had witnessed from Jeff and others in the company. Her words were precise, cutting through the room like a knife. "Mr. Wilson," she said, addressing Jeff directly, "you have repeatedly abused your position of power, harassed employees, and contributed to a culture of racism and sexism. Your actions are not only a violation of company policy, but a violation of basic human decency." Jeff was speechless, his eyes wide with panic. He opened his mouth to protest, but Paul stood up beside Amina, his expression hard. "Effective immediately, Jeff Wilson, you are fired," Paul announced. "And you won't be leaving quietly. Legal action will follow." Security arrived to escort Jeff out of the building, and as he was led away, his arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. Amina turned to the rest of the room, her expression serious but hopeful. "To those of you who have acted with integrity, your jobs are safe. But for those of you who have contributed to the toxic culture here, there will be consequences." Several other members of the management team paled, knowing their time was up. When the dust settled, Amina stood at the head of the table, her company once again under her control. SpinTech would be rebuilt, this time on a foundation of respect, equality, and integrity. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with anticipation as Amina Thompson stepped forward, her posture confident and commanding. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, she was no longer the invisible cleaner that everyone had ignored or mistreated. Today she was reclaiming her rightful place as the true owner of SpinTech. The room fell into a tense silence as she began to speak, her voice steady but laced with authority. For the past few months, Amina started, scanning the room filled with faces that had looked down on her for so long. I have been working undercover as a cleaner. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I needed to see for myself how this company, my company, was being run. Jeff Wilson, who had been leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, suddenly shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest as realization started to dawn. The smirk that had once dominated his face vanished, replaced by a look of shock. Amina's gaze settled on him, cold and unyielding. "Jeff," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "your behavior toward me, and toward others, has been nothing short of despicable." Jeff's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was frozen, his mind scrambling to catch up with the fact that the woman he had treated with such disrespect, the woman he had harassed and humiliated, was now standing before him as his boss. As the owner of the very company he thought he ruled. "I witnessed your arrogance," Amina continued, her tone unwavering. "You made derogatory remarks about my race, my position, and my gender. You assumed that because I was a black woman working as a cleaner, I was beneath you. You treated me like dirt." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Jeff's face drained of color. His once cocky demeanor crumbled as he realized there was no way out. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. Amina didn't let him finish. "You didn't know who I was, but that doesn't excuse how you treated me or anyone else in this company." Her words were firm, leaving no room for excuses. "Your behavior, your racism, your abuse of power, it stops now." Jeff sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide with fear. The rest of the management team shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing that what came next would be a reckoning not just for Jeff but for all of them. Amina stood tall at the head of the table, her authority palpable. She let the silence stretch for a moment, watching Jeff squirm under the weight of his own misdeeds. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice calm but resolute. "You are fired, Jeff." The room erupted into a collective gasp. Some of the board members glanced at each other in disbelief, while others sat frozen, unsure how to react. No one had ever spoken to Jeff this way before, certainly not with such finality. Amina's eyes remained fixed on him. "Your actions have not only violated company policy, but you've also broken the law. The harassment, the racial slurs, the threats, it all ends here. Legal action will follow." Jeff opened his mouth to protest, but Amina cut him off once more. "This is not a debate, Jeff. You've abused your position for too long, and now you will face the consequences." At that moment, 2 security officers entered the room, their presence a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Jeff looked at them in disbelief, his face pale as they approached. "Escort him out of the building," Amina instructed. "He no longer works here." The security officers moved toward Jeff, who was still too stunned to resist. He stammered a few words, trying to defend himself, but nothing coherent came out. The power he had once wielded so carelessly was gone. He was no longer in control. As they led him away, he cast one last glance around the room, looking for support, but found none. The other executives sat in silent shock, their expressions blank. The door closed behind Jeff, and the room was left in an eerie silence. Everyone knew that what had just happened wasn't just about Jeff, it was a sign that things at SpinTech were about to change dramatically. Amina turned back to face the remaining management team, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. The fear in the room was palpable. Karen Theobald, who had spent years lording over her subordinates with an air of superiority, now sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Chris Carter, the corrupt head of finance, fidgeted nervously, knowing that his days of getting away with misuse of company funds were over. Amina's eyes settled on Karen first. "Karen," she began, her tone icy but controlled, "your behavior has been just as toxic. You've fostered a racially hostile environment in this company, belittling employees, particularly women and people of color. You've created a culture of exclusion, where only those who fit your narrow idea of success are given opportunities." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, but she remained silent, too scared to speak. "I've seen the way you talk down to the office staff and cleaners," Amina continued, her voice gaining strength. "You've acted as though you're doing them a favor just by letting them exist in the same building as you." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "That ends today. You're fired, effective immediately." Karen's mouth opened in protest, but she quickly closed it, realizing there was nothing she could say to change the outcome. Amina had seen it all. Karen's reign of intimidation was over. Amina's attention then shifted to Chris Carter. "Chris," she said, her tone cold and unforgiving, "I've uncovered your misuse of company funds. You've been lining your own pockets while undermining the hard work of others. You've consistently dismissed the contributions of minority employees, taking credit for their ideas and demeaning their efforts." Chris looked down, refusing to meet Amina's gaze. He had always thought he could get away with it, that no one would ever find out. But now the truth was out, and there was no escape. "You, too, are fired," Amina stated bluntly. "And like Jeff, legal action will follow." The room was dead silent. The power structure that had once been so firmly in place had crumbled in a matter of minutes. The toxic culture that had allowed people like Jeff, Karen, and Chris to thrive was being dismantled before their very eyes. Amina looked around at the remaining board members, most of whom sat frozen with fear, wondering if they were next. "To those of you who have acted with integrity," she said, her voice softening slightly, "your jobs are safe. But for anyone who has contributed to this toxic culture, know that there will be consequences." A few of the executives exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Amina straightened, her resolve unshaken. "From this moment on, SpinTech will be a place of innovation, respect, and integrity. We will rebuild this company with those values at the forefront, and there will be no room for racism, sexism, or corruption. Anyone who doesn't align with that vision will not be welcome here." With that, the meeting was over. Amina walked out of the room, leaving behind a management team that had been completely upended. The message was clear: SpinTech was no longer a playground for the arrogant and corrupt. Under Amina's leadership, it would become a company where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or position, would be treated with the respect they deserved. The reckoning had come, and SpinTech would never be the same again. Amina Thompson stood confidently at the head of the conference room, her eyes sweeping over the remaining staff of SpinTech. The tension in the air was palpable. The shock from the earlier firings still lingered like a shadow over the room. But there was a shift, an undercurrent of anticipation, as the employees awaited Amina's words. They had once known her only as a quiet cleaner, someone who moved invisibly through the hallways, unnoticed by the very people she had built this company for. Now, she stood before them, not just as their boss, but as the true leader of SpinTech.
Taking a deep breath, Amina began. "For too long, SpinTech has been a place where power, arrogance, and ignorance have overshadowed the true potential of this company. Today, that changes. We will no longer tolerate racism, sexism, or any form of discrimination. SpinTech will be a place where innovation thrives because it is built on a foundation of respect and equality. No more will we let the biases of a few dictate the futures of the many.
Her voice grew stronger, her conviction rippling through the room like a wave. You see, talent knows no color, no gender, no background. Under my leadership, everyone here will be treated with the respect they deserve. We are not just employees, we are a team, and a diverse team at that. Diversity is our strength. And it is through that strength that SpinTech will rise to greater heights. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. The staff exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others looked uncertain, still processing the drastic shift in leadership. But Amina knew they needed more than words, they needed actions. And she had a plan. I promise you this. She continued, her voice softer but no less powerful. Under my leadership, SpinTech will be a place where everyone can thrive. A place where your ideas are valued, where your contributions are recognized, no matter who you are or where you come from. We will rebuild this company together, stronger and better than it ever was before. The room was quiet, but Amina could see the spark of hope igniting in the eyes of some of her employees. The transformation was beginning. She could feel it. Over the next few months, the changes Amina had promised began to take shape. SpinTech, once a company stifled by toxic management and discriminatory practices, was undergoing a revival. Amina wasted no time in implementing new policies, all aimed at fostering an environment of diversity and inclusion. Gone were the days of unchecked egos and closed-door deals that shut out deserving talent. Instead, Amina built a culture that celebrated innovation from every corner of the company. The first change was structural. Amina established a diversity and inclusion task force, made up of employees from different racial, cultural, and professional backgrounds. Their mission was to ensure that hiring, promotions, and everyday workplace interactions were free from bias. Amina herself led these meetings, encouraging open dialogue and honest conversations about the challenges employees faced. Her presence in these discussions was powerful, a reminder that SpinTech's future would be built with everyone's voice. For many employees, especially those who had been overlooked or dismissed because of their race or background, Amina's leadership was a breath of fresh air. Staff who had once felt invisible began to find their place at SpinTech. Amina's policies ensured that no idea went unheard, no contribution went unrecognized. The once rigid hierarchy dissolved, and employees who had been on the margins found themselves stepping into the spotlight. Amina also worked closely with HR to create mentorship programs, pairing junior employees with seasoned professionals to help guide them in their careers. These mentorships weren't just about job training, they were about breaking down the walls that had been built by years of inequality and building bridges across different cultures and experiences. Employees of color, in particular, found new opportunities to grow and succeed in a space where they had once been held back. Even those who had once laughed at Amina during her time undercover began to see her in a new light. They now realized the magnitude of her leadership and how much they had misjudged her. There was admiration, yes, but also respect, a respect that Amina had earned not just because she was the owner, but because she had shown them what true leadership looked like. Under Amina's guidance, SpinTech thrived. Revenue increased as the company launched innovative new products, driven by a workforce that was now more motivated and unified than ever before. Clients noticed the difference. SpinTech was no longer just another tech company. It was a beacon of diversity and excellence, a model for how businesses could succeed by embracing inclusion. Amina's journey had come full circle. Those who had once mistreated her, those who had perpetuated racism and sexism within SpinTech, were now long gone. Jeff Wilson, who had arrogantly cornered her in hallways and belittled her because of her race, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The The lawsuits filed against him for harassment and discrimination had not only ruined his career but had become a cautionary tale within the industry. No longer could someone in his position abuse their power without facing the full weight of justice. Karen Theobald and Chris Carter had also faced their reckoning. The toxic culture they had helped create was dismantled piece by piece, leaving them without the influence they once wielded. Their dismissals were not just a victory for Amina but for all the employees who had been marginalized under their reign. Karma had indeed come for those who thought they were untouchable. But for Amina, this wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing the company she had built from the ground up and ensuring that its future would be better than its past. SpinTech was now a place of integrity, where people were judged by their abilities and character, not by the color of their skin or their gender. One evening, as Amina walked through the halls of SpinTech, she paused to take it all in. The atmosphere was different, now lighter, more collaborative. Employees who had once feared for their jobs now greeted each other with smiles, exchanging ideas and working together in ways that hadn't been possible before.
Amina felt a deep sense of pride. She had reclaimed what was rightfully hers, and in doing so had created a place where others could succeed as well. Her journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. SpinTech was stronger than ever, not just because of the products it produced, but because of the people who made it all possible.
As she left the office that night, Amina smiled to herself. The lesson was clear: those who underestimate or mistreat others based on race, status, or gender will eventually face the consequences of their actions. And in the end, justice will always find its way.